In the American South, there were moments so quiet that history almost forgot them. No gunshots. No rebellion. Just a man standing still, watching his life being divided piece by piece. On a humid morning in the 1840s, an enslaved man stood at the edge of a plantation yard in Virginia. He did not scream. He did not run. He did not collapse. He simply watched as his children were lined up, one by one, not for punishment, but for sale. They were not being sent far away. That was the cruel irony. They were being sold to the same family. To outsiders it looked merciful. The children would remain close. The father would still see them. The plantation owner even claimed it was an act of kindness. But for the man who stood there, chains had simply learned a new language. This was not mercy. It was control. The enslaved man had no legal name. On plantation records he was listed as property, valued for his strength and obedience. But among the slave quarters he was known as a quiet man. Observant. Careful with his words. A father who understood that love in bondage had to be hidden to survive. His children were everything he had. And that was exactly why they were taken. Each child was assigned a new role. One sent to the main house. Another to the fields. Another to the stables. On paper they belonged to different members of the same white family, husband, wife, sons. In reality they belonged to no one, least of all their father. And yet every day he could see them. That was the punishment. He watched his eldest son grow taller under another man's command. He watched his daughter learn to lower her eyes when spoken to by white women who now claimed ownership over her future. He watched his youngest child forget to run toward him. Not because the child didn't love him anymore, but because loving him openly was dangerous. On plantations like this one, separation did not always mean distance. Sometimes, it meant proximity without power. The father could see his children, but he could not protect them. He could hear their cries at night, but he could not intervene. He could feel their fear, but he was forced to remain still. This kind of suffering left no visible scars. That is why it lasted so long. The enslaved man learned quickly that the family who bought his children did not see them as children at all. They were investments. Futures to be shaped, controlled, and exploited. By keeping them nearby, the owners believed they were avoiding cruelty. What they truly avoided was accountability. Because when a child is sold far away, guilt sometimes follows. When a child is kept close, cruelty can pretend to be kindness. The father understood something that many around him did not. Watching was harder than losing. Every day brought a new test. A new humiliation. A new reminder that his role was not to act, but to endure. He adjusted his behavior carefully. Never spoke too long to his children. Never lingered. Never showed anger. He became invisible when he needed to. Silent when silence was required. He learned that survival was not about strength, it was about restraint. But inside him, something was changing. This was not a man planning escape. It was a man recording everything. The way orders were given. The way punishments were justified. The way white children were taught that ownership was normal. He watched. He remembered. And slowly, without anyone noticing, he began to understand that his children were not just being raised as slaves. They were being trained to forget who they were before ownership defined them. That realization hurt more than the chains. Because if they forgot, then slavery would not need violence anymore. It would live quietly inside memory loss. The enslaved man did not know if he would ever be free. He did not know if his children would survive adulthood. But he knew one thing with painful clarity: as long as he could still recognize them as his children, something of himself remained unbroken. What he did not yet know was that this quiet endurance, this forced closeness, would eventually expose a truth the plantation family never intended to reveal. And when that truth surfaced, it would change the fate of everyone living on that land. We begin to see how proximity became the most dangerous thing of all. The plantation family believed proximity solved everything. They spoke of it openly with confidence. The children would be nearby. The father would still see them. Order would be maintained. Productivity would increase. Peace, they said, would follow. But proximity does not soften ownership. It sharpens it. In the weeks after the sale, the enslaved man noticed how the rules changed. His children were no longer addressed as his. Their names were spoken differently. Shortened. Replaced. Corrected. What had once been whispered in the quarters was now called out across yards and hallways by voices that did not know their meaning. The eldest boy was moved to the fields under the supervision of the plantation owner's son. A boy barely older than him, yet armed with authority, a whip he had not earned, and lessons learned by watching adults perform cruelty without consequence. Orders were delivered loudly, as if volume itself created obedience. The father saw it all. He learned the schedules by heart. Dawn assignments. Midday inspections. Evening counts. He positioned himself where he could observe without being accused of lingering. A few steps too close and punishment followed. A few steps too far and rumors began. Balance became survival. His daughter was placed inside the main house. That change was quieter, but far more dangerous. Inside, she learned to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to erase her presence while performing constant labor. The mistress praised her calm nature, calling it good breeding, unaware, or unwilling to admit, that calm had been learned through fear. The father noticed how his daughter stopped looking up, not just at white faces, at anyone's. And then there was the youngest child, still small enough to forget details, still young enough to adapt too quickly. The boy was assigned to the stables, close to the owner's relatives. He learned new routines, new expectations. He learned when to smile, when to stay quiet, when to stand still. Within months, the child began to answer to commands without hesitation. The father felt something inside him tighten. This was the part slavery rarely recorded, the moment when children learned not to look back. On paper, the plantation family congratulated themselves. The arrangement worked. The father remained productive. The children complied. No escape attempts. No disruptions. This, they believed, was proof of benevolence. What they failed to understand was that silence did not mean acceptance. It meant observation. The enslaved man began to see patterns others ignored. How punishment escalated without warning. How mistakes were invented to justify violence. How small privileges were granted, then taken away to reinforce dependence. He watched white children imitate the tone of their parents when speaking to slaves. Watched entitlement take shape before responsibility ever arrived. He memorized faces, voices, habits. At night in the quarters he spoke less than before. Others noticed but did not question him. Silence was common. Curiosity was dangerous. Instead they watched his eyes. How they followed movement. How they measured distance. He was not planning a rebellion. He was learning the machinery. The father also learned something else, something more painful. Keeping his children close did not protect them. It exposed them. They were visible. Always monitored. Always accessible. If a master wanted labor, punishment, or obedience, the children were right there. Distance, cruel as it was, sometimes delayed harm. Proximity invited it. The enslaved man began to understand that the family's decision had nothing to do with kindness. It was about efficiency. Ownership worked best when resistance felt impossible and separation unnecessary. And yet, within that controlled closeness, cracks began to form. The father noticed disagreements among the owners. Quiet arguments about authority, about discipline, about who truly owned which child. Documents existed, but power shifted daily. Each household member believed their claim was strongest. This confusion created moments, brief, fragile moments, where oversight failed. Moments where words could be exchanged in passing. Where glances could communicate warnings. Where memory could be preserved. The father began to use those moments carefully. A phrase here. A reminder there. A story half told, then stopped. He taught his children without appearing to teach them. Lessons disguised as casual comments. Warnings framed as observations. He did not speak of freedom. He spoke of attention. Of noticing changes. Of remembering names even when others tried to erase them. Because memory, he believed, was the last thing ownership could not fully control. The plantation family never noticed this quiet resistance. To them, the father was compliant. His children were obedient. The system worked. But beneath that surface, something fragile was being preserved. Identity. And as the months passed, the father realized that being sold to the same family had created a record, a living one, a pattern of behavior, a chain of decisions, a truth that could not remain hidden forever. The plantation believed closeness ensured control. They never considered that closeness also created witnesses. And witnesses, even silent ones, have a way of changing history. The balance of observation begins to shift, and the plantation family starts to realize that proximity can expose what distance once concealed. Time on the plantation moved in cycles. Seasons, harvests, routines repeated until they felt permanent. The family believed nothing truly changed there. Slaves came and went. Crops rose and fell. Authority remained intact. But beneath that illusion, the enslaved man sensed a shift. It began subtly. A hesitation in orders. A disagreement spoken too loudly. A look exchanged between family members that lingered longer than it should have. Ownership, when divided, often revealed its weakest points. The children, though still controlled, were no longer governed by a single hand. Each member of the family claimed authority over them in different ways. The plantation owner emphasized labor and obedience. His wife focused on behavior and presentation. Their sons treated power like a game, testing limits simply because they could. This fractured control created confusion. And confusion created opportunity. The father noticed that punishments were no longer consistent. One day a mistake was ignored. Another day it was punished harshly. Rules shifted depending on who was watching. The children learned quickly that survival required more than obedience, it required interpretation. So did the father. He observed how each family member reacted to defiance, to fear, to submission. He learned who valued appearance over results, who feared scandal more than suffering, who preferred silence over confrontation. These differences, small as they seemed, shaped everything. The daughter in the main house became central to this fragile balance. She saw what others did not. Conversations held behind closed doors. Arguments whispered after dinner. Letters read then burned. She learned which moods demanded distance and which invited demands. She learned when to disappear and when presence was required. The father watched her carefully. She moved differently now, more cautiously. But there was awareness in her eyes, an understanding that went beyond survival. She had begun to recognize the patterns too. Once, passing her near the wash basin, the father spoke a single sentence. "Listen when they forget you're there." That was all. She did not respond. She did not look at him. But later that night, when their paths crossed again, she paused for just a moment longer than necessary. She had understood. The eldest son, hardened by field labor, learned his own lessons. He saw how overseers competed for approval, how cruelty earned recognition, how restraint was mistaken for weakness. He learned when to endure and when to remember. The youngest, still adapting, became the most dangerous kind of witness. He absorbed everything without fully realizing it. Tone, language, behavior. He learned the plantation's rhythm so deeply that it became instinct. The father feared this, and depended on it, because memory, once embedded, does not fade easily. As months turned into years, the plantation family grew careless. Familiarity bred arrogance. They believed the arrangement had succeeded. The father remained compliant. The children caused no trouble. Stability, they thought, had been achieved. That belief was their mistake. What they did not see was the cost of keeping suffering close. Distance allows denial. Proximity forces repetition. Every day, the same injustices were performed in front of the same witnesses. Over time, those witnesses learned not just what happened, but why. The enslaved man understood now that his role had changed. He was no longer just enduring. He was documenting. In his mind, if nowhere else. He tracked dates, incidents, shifts in authority. He remembered who ordered what, and who pretended not to know afterward. He noticed how stories changed depending on who told them. Truth, he realized, was fragile, but patterns were not. The family's internal tensions began to surface more often. Disputes over money, over inheritance, over reputation. Slaves, once background figures, became part of those arguments. Who owned whom? Who was responsible for mistakes? Who would be blamed if something went wrong? The children were pulled into these conflicts indirectly. Given contradictory orders. Punished for following the wrong one. Their loyalty was tested, not to the father but to the family members who claimed them. The father recognized the danger immediately. Division among owners often ended violently for the enslaved. So he adjusted again. He cautioned silence. Reinforced observation. He reminded his children, quietly and carefully, that confusion was not failure. It was information. Every contradiction revealed something about power. Every argument exposed weakness. The plantation believed ownership created clarity. In truth, it created chaos beneath the surface. And then, one evening, something happened that could not be ignored. A disagreement escalated beyond whispers. Voices rose. Doors slammed. A punishment was ordered, then countermanded. The children were present. Watching. Listening. The father realized in that moment that the family's unity was breaking. And when unity breaks, secrets surface. What began as proximity had turned into exposure. The very closeness meant to control the enslaved man and his children had given them a front row seat to everything the plantation tried to hide. The father did not know how, or when, this knowledge would matter. But he knew one thing with certainty now. The story of this plantation was no longer solely written by its owners. And soon, the truth they had lived beside for years would begin to demand a voice. A single incident forces the plantation family to confront the consequences of keeping suffering too close to ignore. The incident did not arrive with warning. It rarely does. It happened on an afternoon that looked like every other. Heat pressing down on the fields, work moving at its usual pace, the plantation locked into its rhythm. To an outsider, nothing appeared unusual. But those who lived within the system felt the tension immediately. The eldest son was accused of disobedience. The charge was small. A delay. A misunderstanding over an order that had been changed midday. One overseer claimed the boy had ignored him. Another insisted the command had never been given. What should have ended with correction turned into something else. The plantation owner intervened. He did not ask questions. He did not seek clarity. He chose authority over truth. The boy was dragged forward, punishment announced before facts could be settled. It was meant to be swift, a display, not an inquiry. The father watched from a distance. He did not move. He did not speak. He had learned long ago that visible resistance often punished the child more than the parent. But something unexpected happened. The plantation owner's wife objected. Not loudly. Not compassionately. She objected because the punishment, she argued, would disrupt the household. The boy was needed elsewhere that evening. Discipline, she said, could wait. The overseer bristled. The owner hesitated. In that hesitation, control fractured. Voices rose. Authority was questioned. A punishment meant to reinforce order exposed division instead. The boy stood between them, hands bound, eyes fixed on the ground. And everyone noticed. Slaves nearby slowed their work. White children lingered at the edges, pretending curiosity. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Power, once automatic, now required negotiation. The father felt it immediately. This was not about the boy anymore. This was about who commanded the plantation. The punishment was delayed. The boy was sent away under supervision, spared for now. The overseer stormed off. The owner retreated. The wife returned to the house, visibly unsettled. Nothing was resolved. That night, the plantation buzzed quietly. Not with rebellion, but with awareness. Slaves spoke in lowered voices. Movements were cautious. Everyone sensed that something had shifted. The father sought his children when he could. He did not ask what had happened. He asked what had been said. Who had spoken first? Who had hesitated? Who had looked away? The children answered carefully, each from their own position. Together, they formed a clearer picture than any single witness could have. The father understood now that proximity had reached its breaking point. The family's internal conflicts were no longer hidden behind closed doors. They were spilling outward into the lives of those they claimed to own. And that made everyone dangerous. The daughter confirmed what the father suspected. Arguments had been happening more frequently inside the house. Finances, reputation, fear of scrutiny from neighbors. The plantation was no longer as secure as it once appeared. The father listened without interruption. Security, he knew, was an illusion sustained by silence. The youngest child, still close to the family's movements, added something else. Something small but critical. The owner had been drinking more. His temper was less controlled. Decisions were made impulsively, then reversed. Instability had arrived. On plantations, instability often demanded sacrifice. Someone would be blamed. An example would be made. The enslaved man knew this pattern well. So he changed his approach once again. He instructed his children to become forgettable. To blend in. To avoid attention. To observe without reacting. He reminded them that survival depended on timing as much as truth. Because truth, revealed too early, often died unheard. Days passed. Then weeks. The plantation attempted to return to normal. Punishments resumed. Orders were given. But something had been altered permanently. Authority now felt rehearsed, not assumed. The enslaved man sensed that the family feared something they could not name. Witnesses. Not just slaves, but themselves. They had seen their power questioned. Their unity exposed. Their control delayed by disagreement. Once noticed, such moments could not be unseen. The father realized that the sale of his children to the same family had created an unintended consequence. The plantation had produced its own record, one preserved in memory, observation, and shared experience. The family could no longer pretend ignorance. Too many eyes had seen too much. The father did not celebrate this shift. He did not mistake instability for justice. But he recognized its value. Control weakened when it had to explain itself. And now, explanations were failing. He did not know what form the reckoning would take. He did not know who would speak first. He only knew that the system that had relied on proximity to dominate had exposed itself through the very closeness it enforced. The plantation stood outwardly unchanged. But beneath its routines, something irreversible had begun. Fear replaces confidence, and the family's response reveals how close truth has come to the surface. Fear entered the plantation quietly. Not as panic. not as chaos. It arrived as caution. The family began to change how they spoke. Orders were phrased more carefully. Disputes were postponed rather than resolved. The owner, once decisive, now paused before giving commands as if weighing unseen consequences. Confidence had not disappeared, but it had become fragile. The enslaved man noticed immediately. Fear, he knew, altered behavior faster than morality ever could. The plantation's routines continued, but they felt staged. Overseers enforced rules with exaggerated severity, as though trying to reassert authority through volume. The mistress corrected servants more often, even over trivial matters. The sons watched more closely, sensing that power, once effortless, now required performance. And with performance came mistakes. The eldest child was reassigned without explanation. His labor moved between tasks unpredictably, depending on which family member needed to make a point. One day he was praised for speed. The next, reprimanded for haste. The inconsistency was deliberate, an attempt to re-establish dominance through confusion. But confusion no longer worked the way it once had. The children had learned to read it. The daughter noticed something else. Visitors arrived more frequently. Neighbors, distant relatives, men whose conversations ended abruptly when she entered the room. Their presence brought tension. Whispers about behavior, about management, about what was being said. The plantation family, it seemed, feared outside eyes more than internal dissent. The father listened carefully when his daughter shared this. Outsiders meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant records. Records meant accountability, something the plantation was not built to withstand. The youngest child sensed the shift in his own way. Commands became less patient. Mistakes were punished more sharply. The boy learned to disappear emotionally, to comply without expression. It kept him safe for now. The father worried about this most of all. Fear could preserve life, but it could also erase identity. At night, when their paths crossed briefly, the father reminded his children of who they were. Not with speeches. With small details. Names. Stories. Fragments of memory tied to times before ownership defined every interaction. He knew memory was becoming dangerous, because the plantation family had begun to suspect it. The owner confronted the father one afternoon, not with accusations but with curiosity. He asked questions that sounded casual but were carefully chosen. How the children were adjusting. Whether they were causing trouble. Whether they spoke often. The father answered calmly. Briefly. Respectfully. Fear had taught him restraint. The owner studied him longer than usual before walking away. That look lingered in the father's mind. It was not suspicion alone, it was calculation. The family was beginning to see proximity differently. What once felt like control now felt like risk. The children, kept close to maintain order, had become witnesses to the plantation's instability. Their presence reminded the family of moments they wished forgotten. Arguments. Hesitations. Weakness. The father sensed the danger rising. Plantations did not respond to fear by reforming. They responded by removing evidence. He adjusted again. The children were instructed to speak less, to observe more, to share only what was necessary, and only when alone. He warned them that attention, once drawn, could not be undone. This was not retreat. It was preservation. The plantation family began discussing separation again. Not openly. In fragments. Comments about efficiency. About convenience. About restoring order. The same language used before the sale returned, but now with urgency. The father recognized it immediately. Closeness had failed them. The very arrangement meant to reinforce control had created something uncontrollable, shared awareness. Too many moments had been seen. Too many truths overheard. Fear was no longer theoretical. It was shaping decisions. One evening, the father overheard a conversation not meant for him. A remark about simplifying matters. About avoiding complications. The words were vague but the meaning was clear. Someone would be moved. Someone would be erased from view. The father did not panic. Panic wasted time. Instead he measured risk. Which child was most visible? Which one knew the most? Which one would be easiest for the family to justify removing? His conclusion was painful, but certain. The daughter. She saw too much. She heard too much. She remembered everything. The father knew that whatever came next would not be accidental. It would be framed as necessity, as order, as discipline. The plantation family would call it correction. History would call it something else. The father understood now that proximity had brought them to a turning point. The family's fear was no longer hidden. It was guiding action. And when fear acts, it rarely does so gently. He did not know what choice the plantation would make, but he knew the consequences would reshape everything that followed. In the next, the family attempts to erase a problem they created, and in doing so, reveals just how much power they have already lost. The decision was never announced. It appeared instead as a change in routine, a reassignment spoken casually, a trunk brought down from storage, a list adjusted without explanation. On plantations, the most permanent actions were often carried out quietly. The daughter was to be moved, not sold, at least not in name. She was to be sent to assist a relative on a neighboring property. Temporary, they said. Practical. Beneficial to all involved. The language was careful, rehearsed, meant to sound reasonable. The father understood what it meant. Removal without record. Distance without accountability. He learned of it from the daughter herself. Not through words, but through the way she paused beside him one evening longer than usual. Her eyes met his briefly, steady, controlled, already preparing. "They say I leave at first light," she whispered just once. The father did not ask where. He did not ask for how long. He already knew the answers would change nothing. What mattered was what remained. That night, the plantation felt heavier. Even the air seemed reluctant to move. The father lay awake, measuring time not in hours but in memories. Every sound carried meaning now. Footsteps, doors, voices fading down hallways. He remembered the first day his children had been sold. The promise of proximity. The assurance that separation would not happen again. He understood now how easily promises dissolved when fear demanded convenience. The daughter prepared quietly. She did not cry. She did not protest. She packed what little she was allowed: clothes, a small cloth, nothing that would invite questions. Everything else she left behind. Memory could not be confiscated. Before dawn, the father found her once more. There was no speech. No final instruction. Only a brief exchange, words chosen carefully, as if each one might be overheard by history itself. "Remember," he said. She nodded. That was enough. The family oversaw her departure with efficiency. No ceremony. No witnesses beyond those required. The owner's wife gave instructions. The sons avoided looking at her. The overseer hurried the process along. To them it was a correction. To the father it was confirmation. The plantation had chosen erasure over reform. As the wagon pulled away, the father did not move. He stood where he was expected to stand. He did not follow with his eyes for too long. He did not give the family reason to accuse him of attachment. But something in him hardened. The closeness that once allowed observation had now revealed its true cost. The plantation's fear had turned into action. And that action had consequences. The remaining children felt it immediately. The eldest withdrew further. His movements became precise, efficient. He learned to appear indifferent, to avoid becoming useful as a symbol. The youngest grew quieter, absorbing the absence without fully understanding it. The father adjusted once again. He spoke even less, watched even more. The plantation family attempted to restore order. They spoke of improvement, of renewed discipline, of removing distractions. But the removal had only intensified awareness. Absence leaves space, and space invites questions. The father noticed how others on the plantation reacted. Slaves whispered cautiously. They had seen this pattern before. When someone was removed quietly, it was never without reason. It meant danger had been perceived. And danger, once acknowledged, rarely faded. The owner avoided the father for days. When they did cross paths, the owner's gaze lingered briefly, measuring, assessing. He no longer saw compliance. He saw knowledge. That unsettled him. The plantation's unity did not recover. The family's arguments resumed, sharper now. The daughter's absence had not solved the problem. It had exposed it. She had not been the source of instability. She had been the witness. And now others remained. The father understood something critical in the days that followed. The plantation could remove individuals. It could not remove memory. Every action taken in fear left a trace. Every attempt at control revealed motive. The father and his remaining children carried those traces with them, quietly, carefully, deliberately. The system had shown its hand. It preferred disappearance to accountability. That knowledge changed everything. The father no longer wondered if truth would matter. He wondered when. He wondered who would be forced to confront it. He wondered how long the plantation could continue pretending that silence meant safety. Because silence, he knew now, was not empty. It was full of witnesses. And the plantation had underestimated how many remained. The consequences of removal ripple outward. drawing attention the family cannot control and setting the stage for a reckoning they never planned to face. The removal did not bring the quiet the plantation expected. Instead, it drew attention. Absence has a way of doing that. Where a person once moved, worked, listened, and remembered, a void remained. Others noticed it immediately. Questions were not asked aloud, but they spread nonetheless, carried in glances and pauses. The father felt the change almost at once. Work slowed. Not deliberately but subtly. Instructions had to be repeated. Mistakes, once anticipated, now surfaced unexpectedly. The rhythm the plantation relied upon began to falter. Not enough to justify punishment, but enough to frustrate those in charge. Frustration led to scrutiny. Overseers watched more closely. The family hovered longer than usual. Their presence, meant to restore authority, only heightened unease. Everyone sensed that something had gone wrong even if no one named it. The eldest child noticed visitors again. More than before. Men on horseback arrived without notice. They spoke privately with the owner, then left without ceremony. Their faces carried concern rather than curiosity. News traveled quickly in places built on secrecy. The plantation had become a subject of conversation. The father understood the danger immediately. Attention from outside could cut both ways. It could expose wrongdoing, or provoke retaliation. Plantations, when threatened, often turned inward, tightening control in destructive ways. The family responded by asserting order more aggressively. Punishments increased in frequency, if not severity. Rules were enforced unevenly, creating tension rather than compliance. The sons tested authority openly now, eager to prove strength where they sensed weakness. The father watched carefully. Power, when insecure, often reveals itself through excess. The youngest child became a focus of concern. His silence, once tolerated, now drew suspicion. Overseers mistook quiet observation for defiance. The boy learned to speak when spoken to, nothing more. The father intervened subtly. He redirected attention. Took responsibility for minor errors. Absorbed reprimands meant for others. It was a dangerous strategy, but a necessary one. Better one target than many. The plantation owner confronted him again. This time the tone was different. Less casual. More direct. Questions pressed harder. The owner wanted reassurance, proof that order still existed. That loyalty remained intact. The father responded with humility, not fear. He understood that fear would only confirm suspicion. The owner left unsatisfied. That unsettled him more than open conflict would have. Meanwhile, rumors grew. Neighbors whispered about internal disputes. About a servant sent away unexpectedly. About rising tension. In a society built on reputation, such talk carried weight. The plantation family felt exposed. And exposure demanded response. The father sensed that the family was nearing another decision, one more drastic than the last. Removal had not worked. Silence had not returned. The system was straining under its own contradictions. Closeness had created too many witnesses. The plantation had to choose between change and control. History suggested they would choose control. The father prepared his remaining children quietly. He did not explain everything. He did not need to. They had learned to read danger by watching adults who pretended none existed. He reinforced lessons of attention, of restraint, of endurance. But beneath those lessons lay something new. Expectation. The father no longer asked whether something would happen. He waited for what? The plantation owner called a meeting. Not formally. Not publicly. Just a gathering of authority, family, overseers, advisors. The father was not present, but he felt the consequences before they reached him. Orders shifted. Assignments changed. Eyes followed him longer than before. The plantation was making plans. Plans shaped by fear, embarrassment, and the need to reassert dominance. The father understood that whatever came next would be meant as a statement, not just to him but to everyone watching. But statements once made can be interpreted. And interpretation once shared becomes narrative. The plantation had already lost control of that. They had kept the father and his children close to maintain silence. Instead, they had created a story too visible to contain. The father stood at the center of it, not as a rebel, not as a hero, but as a witness who refused to forget. And in systems built on forgetting, memory itself is dangerous. The plantation makes its boldest move yet, one that reveals just how fragile its authority has become. The plantation's next move was meant to be decisive. It came not as punishment but as reorganization. The family announced changes designed to restore efficiency. Labor groups were rearranged. Supervision shifted. Boundaries were reinforced. On the surface it looked like management. In truth it was containment. The father was reassigned. Not removed, not elevated, relocated. His work would now keep him farther from his remaining children, though still within sight. The distance was intentional. Close enough to monitor. Far enough to weaken influence. The family believed this would solve everything. It did not. Distance did not erase connection. It clarified it. The father adapted quickly. He learned new routes, new vantage points, new rhythms. From where he worked now, he could see more of the plantation than before. He observed patterns others overlooked. Who watched whom, who avoided whom, who moved freely and who did not. Control, he realized, required constant adjustment. And adjustment revealed uncertainty. The eldest child felt the shift immediately. Overseers scrutinized him more closely, testing whether separation would disrupt obedience. They found what they did not expect. Consistency. The boy worked steadily. Responded calmly. Avoided attention. His composure unsettled them. Power expects reaction. Silence unsettles it. The youngest, meanwhile, became the focus of forced kindness. The family's sons began addressing him directly, assigning small tasks, offering praise meant to buy loyalty. It was another form of control, softer but no less dangerous. The father saw it clearly. Ownership does not always rely on fear. Sometimes it seeks gratitude. The plantation believed it could divide influence without consequence. But influence, once internalized, does not obey distance. The lessons the father had taught his children did not fade when he stepped away. They surfaced more clearly. The daughter's absence weighed heavily now. Her removal had not silenced questions. It had intensified them. Others noticed how her duties had been divided. How no one spoke her name. Erasure, once attempted, rarely succeeds. The plantation family began to feel surrounded, not by resistance but by awareness. Slaves moved carefully. Watched closely. Conversations ended when authority approached. This was not obedience. It was calculation. The owner sensed it. His temper worsened. Decisions became reactive. He corrected subordinates publicly, desperate to reassert command. The overseers followed suit, amplifying severity to compensate for uncertainty. But severity could not repair fracture. The father recognized the moment for what it was. The system was trying to reset itself. Resets fail when underlying conditions remain unchanged. The plantation still carried its witnesses. Still housed memory. Still contained those who had seen its weakness. The family's response only confirmed what the father already knew. They were afraid. And fear, when prolonged, leads to exposure. One afternoon, a visiting official arrived. Not a neighbor. Not a relative. Someone with authority beyond the plantation. His presence altered behavior immediately. Politeness replaced severity. Smiles appeared where tension had lived. The father watched carefully. External authority changes dynamics. It forces performance. The official toured the grounds. Asked questions. Observed labor. His gaze lingered longer than the family liked. He noticed inconsistencies. Gaps. Absences. The daughter's name was not mentioned. But absence speaks. The father understood then that the plantation had crossed a threshold. It could no longer contain its own narrative. Others were beginning to see what had been hidden through routine. The family's attempt at control had drawn exactly what they feared. Attention. And attention, once focused, does not easily look away. The father did not rejoice in this. He did not assume justice would follow. He knew too well how often systems protected themselves. But something irreversible had occurred. The plantation had been observed. Recorded in more than memory. And once that happens, power must answer questions it was never meant to face. The family's effort to manage appearances backfires, forcing a confrontation that will define the future of everyone involved. The confrontation did not happen all at once. It unfolded in fragments, questions asked too carefully, answers given too quickly, glances exchanged where certainty once lived. The visiting official returned, this time unannounced. His arrival disrupted the plantation's performance before it could fully prepare. The family adjusted instantly. Smiles sharpened. Voices softened. Order was displayed with precision. But performance, when repeated too often, begins to reveal its seams. The official asked about labor assignments. About recent changes. About the reassignment of workers. The plantation owner explained confidently, framing every decision as efficiency. The words sounded practiced. Too practiced. The father was called forward, not as a subject of concern but as an example. His composure was meant to reassure. He stood where directed, spoke only when addressed. His answers were respectful, measured, unremarkable. That was precisely the problem. The official noticed how carefully he spoke, how he chose words without hesitation, how he avoided looking toward certain areas of the plantation. These were not signs of ignorance. They were signs of awareness. Awareness unsettles authority. The official asked about family arrangements, about children, about recent transfers. The plantation owner hesitated for the briefest moment, long enough to be noticed. She was sent to assist elsewhere, he said. No name was given. No destination offered. The official nodded, but his gaze lingered. That afternoon, the plantation was inspected more thoroughly than before. Records were reviewed. Schedules compared. Statements quietly cross-checked. The family's confidence thinned with every step. The father felt the weight of attention shift. He had lived long enough to know that scrutiny could end in two ways: exposure or retaliation. He prepared for both. The remaining children sensed it too. The eldest avoided eye contact with overseers. The youngest followed instructions precisely, without hesitation. They had learned when to become invisible. The plantation owner grew impatient. He corrected servants sharply, spoke over explanations. His need to control the narrative became obvious. The official noticed that as well. Authority, when defensive, reveals more than it conceals. By evening, the tone had changed. The family was no longer hosting a visitor. They were responding to one. The difference was subtle, but decisive. The official did not accuse. He did not threaten. He observed, asked, took notes. That restraint frightened the family more than confrontation ever could have. The father was dismissed without comment. As he walked away, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not hope, not relief, recognition. For the first time, the plantation story was being heard by someone who did not belong to it. That did not guarantee justice, but it disrupted certainty. The family gathered privately that night. Voices rose, then dropped. Decisions were argued, then deferred. They disagreed not about what had happened, but about how much had been seen. The plantation could no longer rely on silence. The father sensed that the family was reaching for control once more, this time through finality. When systems feel cornered, they often act decisively, believing boldness will erase doubt. He prepared himself. He did not know what shape that action would take. Separation, punishment, removal. He had seen them all before. What he knew was this: the plantation had been marked. Once marked, it could not return to ignorance. The closeness that once enabled control had now forced exposure. The witnesses were no longer only enslaved. They were external. The father understood that whatever happened next would echo beyond the plantation's borders. The family's choices would be remembered, recorded, repeated. History had entered the property quietly, and it was not leaving. The plantation makes its final attempt to reclaim control, an action meant to end uncertainty, but one that instead seals its legacy.